All right, it's 12 o'clock, and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms Conservation webinar. I'm Matt Helmers here at Iowa State University. Fortunate to be back to host this webinar this week. I was in lovely Houston, Texas last week, so I missed out. It was nice and cool down there. But enough about that. We are here today to hear from Dr. Kay Stefanik, that's the Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and she's going to talk about the nitrogen load model that we used as part of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, and looking at improving the flexibility of that to use it at the watershed scale. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Stefanik, and as always, if you have questions, feel free to type those in the chat box, and we will get those to Kay at the end of her talk. With that, Kay, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. So I'm going to be talking about modifications made to the end load model for the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. I'm sure many of you in the meeting right now are familiar with nutrient contributions from agricultural landscapes. And this is a map of total nitrogen contributions from not just the Midwest, but also from the Mississippi River Basin. We have high both nitrogen and phosphorus loss from our row crop acres due to nutrients from fertilizer and manure not being completely taken up by the crops that we're growing. So the stuff that's not taken up can end up in our waterways. And in the case of nitrogen and phosphorus, it can end up in our waterways in Iowa, but also eventually make it to the Mississippi River, where it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. And this has caused some issues within the Gulf of Mexico itself. We've had some large-scale impacts because of this nitrogen and phosphorus loss from our ag landscape. The biggest is the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is shown here on as red. And with this hypoxic zone, it's just an area of low oxygen that's in the Gulf that persists for usually a couple months over the course of the summer. And Iowa specifically, between 1999 and 2016, has contributed about 29% on average to that nitrogen load to the Gulf of Mexico. So to help reduce this hypoxic zone, the Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Watershed Nutrient Task Force put out a Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan in 2008. And the purpose of this plan is for reducing the size of that hypoxic zone through kind of controlling and mitigating nutrient loss in the Mississippi River Basin. Now, we're at 12 states in the Mississippi River Basin, including Iowa, that were called on to develop and implement their own strategies for nutrient reduction. So this is a state-by-state nutrient reduction to improve the overall quality of the Gulf of Mexico. From that, we get the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. This is a framework to both assess and to come up with ways to improve or reduce our nutrient loss from the state of Iowa. The reduction strategy was released in 2013. It contained a detailed science assessment for both nitrogen and phosphorus, and this includes science assessments associated with both point and non-point source nitrogen and phosphorus. And I'm primarily going to be focusing on the non-point source because this is where we count our agricultural nitrogen and phosphorus losses. In this strategy, there is also a number of agricultural management practices that were laid out that could be used to help reduce nutrient loss. These include things like cover crops and various edge of field practices, just to name a few. And then within this, there's also kind of looking at the scale of implementation needed to reach nutrient reduction goals. And when I say goals, this comes from that Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan. One of the big goals of that was to reduce the the extent of the hypoxic zone to less than 1,930 square miles. And right now, past 5-year running average, it's been at 5,408 square miles. So we want to see a big reduction in that size through the practices we implement in our state, through the nutrient reduction practices implemented in our state. And we want to see 45% reduction in total nitrogen and total phosphorus loads. Specifically from non-point source, we're looking at 41% reduction in nitrogen and 29% reduction in phosphorus. And the way that the nutrient reduction strategy was set up, it took into account that it's going to take time to see improvements. So when we talk small scale, which you see on the left, as well as time frame, which is on the right in this graph or diagram, we should be seeing small scale changes under 10 years. And then once we get to that 20 plus years, we'd see changes across the state in nutrient load export based on changes that we make by implementing practices. Now, as part of the reduction strategy, there was a science assessment that was done. And as part of this, a nitrate end load model was created. This model was created specifically to estimate the nitrate nitrogen transport from non-point sources. The way this was developed was that it was on an MLRA, or major land resource area scale. And with these major land resource areas, there are 10 of these in the state, and they each have kind of distinct geology, soil, climate, as well as land use. And within each of these MLRAs, data was collected on things like the extent of row crop acres, the types of rotation that was used, fertilizer and manure application rates, and things like water yield, to create equations to estimate what the nitrate transport would be to or from Iowa. And from these MLRA scale, so we could estimate nitrate loss in each of these MLRAs, but it would also allow for a statewide estimate of nitrate nitrogen loss. This was originally set up as an Excel module. It was run for what's considered baseline estimates. So this is the time period from 1980 to 1996. It's also been run for what's called the benchmark period, which is from 2006 to 2010. And it's also been set up and run for different scenarios for reaching the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy goals. These scenarios include individual practice implementation. So we could look at just what implementing cover crops on so many acres would do. But the scenarios are also set up so that you could have run it for multiple practices being implemented across the landscape. Now, with this end load model, it has been used for the nutrient reduction strategy, but then also pieces of it have been used for other projects looking to model nitrogen loss. And one of these projects includes use in the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, the ACPF. So the ACPF used some of the equations that were in that original end load model. However, with this end load model, there wasn't much done in terms of direct validation of the model using watershed data. On the left here, this graph shows kind of what was done for some of the validation. And this is a graph of a comparison between some observed flow-weighted average nitrate nitrogen concentrations on the x-axis, and on the y is kind of calculated flow-weighted average nitrate nitrogen concentration that was done using GIS and specific parameters like land use and nitrogen application rates. So there's no direct validation of the end load model with watershed data, just kind of what's on the screen here. So the purpose of this work was to first modify the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy nitrate end load model to allow for those finer scale watershed level and loss estimates, but then also to validate it at the watershed scale. And to do this, we're comparing our output from that modified end load model to outputs from the weighted regression on time, discharge, and season, or WRTDS model. And this model, specifically for what we're using it for, the model estimates were based on measurements collected at USGS gauge stations in the state. So USGS gauge station actual data went into kind of developing and refining this WRTDS model, and then we're comparing the output from that WRTDS model to what we get from our modified nitrate end load model. We are looking at this at 4 different USGS gauge stations. We have the Nishnabotna River above Hamburg, the Raccoon River at Van Meter, the Cedar River at Cedar Rapids, and then the Iowa River at Wapello. And the reason that these 4 areas were chosen is because first it gives kind of a representation of what's happening throughout the state, but there's also some decent long-term data that's been collected at those specific gauge stations. For all of these, there has been USGS as well as Iowa Department of Natural Resources data available at these sites since the 1970s. So that's one of the reasons why we chose these particular gauge stations and watersheds. To actually do this, we first modified the end load model. With that initial Excel spreadsheet and module that was put together for the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, the equations and the data to run the model were all within that one spreadsheet. And in a few cases, some of that information was in the equations themselves. So the first thing that was done was we separated the equations from the data from that Excel spreadsheet. The equations were converted to R code. And R is, it's an open source software, so free software for statistical computing and graphics. So we separated that out. We put the equations in the R code, and then we have separate Excel spreadsheets for the data that get loaded into this program R to actually run the models. We made some minor modifications for equations to use at the watershed scale. And this was really kind of small scale changes to make sure we were pulling data from the appropriate places. So for the original model, since it was done on the MLRA scale, in some equations, we had to pull in area of MLRA. When we're working on the watershed scale, pulling in area of MLRA doesn't really work. So we had to modify those equations so we were pulling data from the appropriate sources that match with the scale of the data we're putting into the model. We also used ArcGIS to estimate watershed parameters from county as well as MLRA scale data for use in this modified end load model. We ran the model and then did a comparison of the model with the WRTDS model. And we specifically looked at that baseline comparison timeframe from 1980 to 1996. And we looked at flow-weighted mean concentration, load, and yield. So that's what we compared for our nitrate nitrogen. We pulled data from a few different sources for our modified end load model. Most of it was at the county level. So we had some fertilizer and manure and application rate data, as well as type of fertilizer and manure that was applied. We pulled some information from the U.S. Census of Agriculture, which is conducted by the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service. All of this is online and freely available. We pulled from the 1982, 1987, 1992, and 1997 documents. And we only looked at those years because that's all that's available for the census. The census is done on a 5-year basis. So we pulled data from those specific timeframes. And what we pulled from this were mostly acres. So area of different things like acres of corn planted for different uses, for grain, for silage, acres of soybean. And then we used that information to calculate extended rotation acres, corn soybean rotation acres, continuous corn acres, and pasture and hay. We also got some information on CRP acres. And then on the MLRA scale, we used water yield. Water yield is the amount of water leaving the landscape and flowing down to various streams and rivers. And this was kind of a 30-year estimate that was used for our water yield. Now we have county and MLRA scale data, but we want to run this for a watershed scale. So we used ArcGIS to convert this data to a watershed scale. The first thing was bringing in various shapefiles, county, HUC, MLRA scales, and we clipped the county or MLRA by the watershed so that we can match the data using that area scale. So it was the area used to scale. So you can see on the image on the right here, where my cursor is kind of hovering, that purple spot, that is the portion of the West Nishnabotna River watershed that's in Potawatomi County. So we have, say, corn acres planted in Potawatomi. We can estimate that, we'll just say this is about, the Nishnabotna, West Nishnabotna is about 50% of that area. So we scaled the overall corn acres from that county down to just what would potentially be in that portion of the watershed in that county. You'll also notice on this image, there's a little diamond down at the bottom here. That is the USGS gauge station. And the USGS gauge station isn't at the bottom of this watershed. So to make sure we weren't calculating in or putting in data for more area than we were actually kind of comparing with the WRTDS, we used S-class digital elevation models, or DEM files, and the ArcGIS spatial analyst toolbox to determine the area of this overall watershed that's draining into each of these gauge station points. Anything that's not draining into this gauge station, we cut out from data to be included in the model. So this allowed for that direct comparison between the modified end load model and the WRTDS model run by USGS, since those points are where they have information from. So once we had all of the ArcGIS information converted to watershed scale, we ran our modified end load model, and then we compared the numbers from the end load model to the WRTDS model. And this was run by someone from USGS. And then we did a statistical analysis of the outputs. We used a Monte Carlo permutation analysis to test the null hypothesis that the modeled output is within the same distribution as the WRTDS model. So if the modeled output is within the WRTDS model, the models are comparable. And we ran 5,000 permutation simulations using R, that free statistical program. Getting into our results, for the table here, the area in blue is the WRTDS model, so what was done with USGS. And then the white on the right-hand side is the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy modified end load model. And we have it for our different watersheds. You can see for flow, we kind of ranged from about 8.68 to 11.41 in WRTDS. And then for our modified end load model, we range from about 8.24 to 11.62 inches. For flow weighted mean concentration, WRTDS ranged from about 6.4 to 9.0, whereas the flow weighted mean concentration for the end load model ranged from about 5.9 to 7.3. Annual load for WRTDS ranged from 10.5 to 58.3. And we expected this big variation across all watersheds because some of these watersheds are a little larger. But we see comparable numbers for our annual load with the end load model, and similar for the yield as well. With our permutation analysis, we have our p-values for flow, load, yield, and flow-weighted mean concentration. All of our p-values were above 0.85. This tells us that the null hypothesis was supported, that the two models, the WR-TDS output and modified end-load model, are comparable. And looking at kind of some more direct comparisons of the model data beyond what was just in that table. So I'm going to be showing, and the next, I believe, 4 slides are kind of QQ plots, or one-to-one line plots that show the output of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy modeled information on the x-axis, and then the WR-TDS data on the y-axis. We have our one-to-one line that runs in the middle. The closer these points are to that one-to-one line, the better the agreement was between the two modeled estimates. For our flow, you can see that Iowa, Cedar, and Raccoon were kind of below that one-to-one line. That means that with our modified end-load model, we were seeing higher, just slightly higher flow rates with that model compared to the WR-TDS output. And then we saw the opposite for Nishnabotna. For our concentrations, Iowa and Cedar were both estimated a little higher with the end-load model compared to the WR-TDS, but then lower for the Raccoon and Nishnabotna rivers. For our load comparison, you can see we have, we're pretty close to that one-to-one line for Nishnabotna and Raccoon, so it's pretty decent. And then Iowa and Cedar River watersheds, we had a little bit of overestimation with the modified end-load model. And then once again, kind of similar with our annual yield, annual nitrate yield. Cedar and Iowa rivers were estimated a little higher with the modified end-load model, and then lower for Raccoon and Nishnabotna. Now, specifically for these two models, we also looked at percent difference of what we got from the end-load model versus the WR-TDS model estimates. And we have it for all 4 of our parameters across all 4 watersheds. And what we saw was that all of our parameters were within 20% of what was estimated from the WR-TDS model. And in some places, especially for, if you look at flow, for Cedar and Iowa River, we were within 2% of the WR-TDS estimate, so relatively good. Now, from this, our permutation analysis suggests that the 2 models are comparable. They do provide comparable outputs at the watershed scale, specifically for this baseline period of 1980 to 1996. When you look at the one-to-one graphs, or the QQ plots, we didn't see any consistent over or underestimation. So if all of our points had been kind of below that one-to-one line, that would have suggested a large-scale overestimation of the end-load model. We didn't see any of that. We had kind of consistent above and below that one-to-one line. So there wasn't anything to suggest an overall bias that was pushing the end-load model either too high or too low. We also found that the modifications that we made to the end-load model did allow for multi-scale data input. So we were able to put in, easily add in that watershed scale data. With this R code, now that we've kind of taken the equations and separated them from the data that was in that Excel spreadsheet originally and put it into R code, having those equations separate gives us more flexibility in the R code and allows for output at multiple scales. So in this case, we were looking at 4 specific kind of watershed areas. But the way that the code is currently set up in R, you could potentially run this at multiple HUC scales. So HUC 8, HUC 10, HUC 12 even. assuming you have the appropriate data to put into the model. It is something that still would need to be tested, but the model is set up to be run at those different scales. We also left in the ability to run the model at the MLRA scale as well as kind of the state scale. So there's a lot of potential for how this could be used. And right now, the R code isn't available, but we are going to be making it available on GitHub after we get a manuscript published on this work. It'll be available on GitHub along with the templates for the Excel data sheets that you'll need to kind of import into R to run the code. We'll also make this available on request if you're not available or not able to get it through GitHub. And some conclusions from this. So modifying the INRS end load model for use at the watershed scale has the potential to aid in developing more targeted watershed approaches to nutrient management for nitrate reductions. One thing I forgot to mention is that showing that we have a good comparison between our model and then what came out of the WRTDS model, this kind of lends additional support to the output that we were getting from the original end load model that was used in the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. And finally, while this modified end load model can be used to estimate watershed scale nitrate end losses, it also has the capability to forecast future nitrate reductions due to increased practice implementation. So implementation of things like cover crops, changes in manure or fertilizer use, or various edge of field practices. In that R code, we have kind of factored in all of the various different scenarios that are run through the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. So we have the ability to add in either actual implementation acres or numbers of things going in, or we could use it to forecast if we were to put in this many acres of cover crops or add in this many wetlands treating so many acres of tile drain land. We could come up with some forecasts on what the nitrate end reductions would be based on that. And with that, just want to say thank you. And I want to acknowledge the collaborators on this project, Matt Helmers with Iowa State University and Stephen Kalkoff with USGS, who supplied us with the WRTDS model numbers for the project. And then if you are in need of Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Unit, make sure you contact Liz Ripley by email. Her email is here on the screen by 5 p.m. today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar if different, and your number.
Can jump in, Kay, if you want to catch your breath, and I will plug the webinar for next week, an overview of carbon sequestration and ecosystems. So it's about that time of year that we get somebody from North Carolina State University. We've had Dr. Bill Hunt a number of times, and now we'll have Dr. Burchell that will be here as a professor and extension leader at NC State University. Have had some questions come in, and I have two to start with. One is you commented about being able to use this for, kind of looking at the impacts of implementing various practices. And would those kind of the estimated performance of those practices be consistent with what's in the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, kind of from that practice list, the estimated percent reductions of those, or any updates that may be coming in the future?
Yes, so those estimates would be consistent with what is currently in the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. The way it's set up, if there are any updates to those estimates, those could easily be added in. But right now we have what was originally done in the nutrient reduction strategy.
There was a question here whether you'd run any of the practice scenarios, the examples, to see how it compared with the the spreadsheet model, the old spreadsheet model with everything. I'm not sure about that, but I think you had at least compared the spreadsheet model for the benchmark period with the with the R code model, if I'm not mistaken, and they matched.
Close. Yes. There was a match. I ran them for both. So I ran them for the original benchmark period and compared the R code to what was obtained from the MLRA scale benchmark period, and those were almost identical. And then I also did a comparison of all of the scenario runs, and those were also almost identical.
If annual precip in Iowa is increased since the baseline period, how would this affect the end load model, or could the end load model be adapted to account for that, I guess, in the future?
So right now, precipitation is factored in through the water yield, and that was a 30-year estimate that was done. Actually, Matt, do you happen to know the time frame?
Yeah, I think Bill's probably on. He'll probably from about 1980 to 2010, I think, is about the time frame that was used for estimating or for using precip to estimate water yield. Mm-hmm. So it's a long-term average, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So right now, that's what's being factored in for precipitation. That water yield, so I mentioned the original spreadsheet had equations and data in the same spreadsheet, and in some occasions the data was within the equations. So what I did was completely separated the equations from the data, and right now the water yield, it factors into, but the specific numbers are not in that R code. So you can modify those in the Excel spreadsheet that you'd load into the R code to run it. So it would be very easy to update the water yield numbers if you had that information. And right now, that's the only way to add in precipitation to these models.
Yeah, that's a huge improvement compared to our spreadsheet, because then the water yield isn't in the equation, so you could more easily adjust that as you move forward. So it's a question about the scenarios. Well, I guess whether we'd conducting additional scenarios that might happen in the future, I guess we'd just have to see about the need. I'll answer that one. But are bioreactors included as a conservation practice in the end load model for this?
Yes, bioreactors are included.
Okay. There is two questions on this, and this always hate to have to ask this one, but any timeline on the article or any release of anything?
So right now the manuscript is almost done. It does have to go through USGS approval processes, and then after that we will get it submitted to a journal. Hopefully within 6 months it'll be published, but that part's kind of out of our hands.
We'll see how well it's reviewed, and then if anybody's on that's reviewing it, make it go fast. Okay. So I guess there's a question: how regionally specific do you think this end load model is, and or what might be needed in different regions?
Let's see. Trying to think for the modify. I think water yield would be very important to modify. I feel like a lot of what goes into the model has potential for use, I'd say, within the Midwest. I'm not sure I'd be comfortable saying beyond the Midwest, but there would need to be some changes on things like definitely the water yield. But I believe there are also Matt, you would probably know better with the drainage. There may be some things in there with drainage that would need to be modified as well.
So one of the things that is kind of interesting about this is we don't necessarily differentiate when we in the spreadsheet model, the original spreadsheet model, we didn't necessarily differentiate between tile drained acres and non-tile drained acres as contributing to the N outflow. But even when we do that, you can see that for a watershed such as Nishnabotna, we still had pretty good agreement between the N load compared to a watershed like the Raccoon. And so I think all of our cropland acres are losing some nitrate. Some may be delivered through a tile line and some may be delivered through longer flow pathways. And we didn't do quite as much with distinguishing whether that N was delivered through a tile line or through lateral subsurface flow pathways, at least when we did the original one. Oh yeah, okay. So there was kind of, maybe you can go back to that graph on the, go back to the INRS graph that compared GIS flow-weighted nitrate concentrations to the, yeah, okay, keep going. Where was that one? That one, yeah. That these were not at, those were watershed scale. So those were some that had been pulled where there was watershed level data for the observed flow-weighted nitrate and the GIS flow-weighted nitrate. And that GIS flow-weighted nitrate would have been similarly based on land use, fertilizer, water yield, and well, what sometimes we refer to as a universal N curve, I guess.
Yeah. So this, if we could I
Bill.
jump in? Yeah. So this would work largely that Greg Stefanik did, GIS based at a fine grid scale using county fertilizer data, universal nitrogen curve that you mentioned, land use, including grasses, but cropland and the rest, and 39 stream monitoring stations at watershed scale throughout the state, well, primarily on the Des Moines level, but throughout the state. So it is, in fact, a model prediction based on land use, fertilizer application, response, water yield compared to measured data, which is a validation.
Yeah, we did. Yep. Okay. So, and then one other question I wanted to ask Kay was the WRTDS, while that's it's kind of a model, but it really is using measured information to interpolate concentrations of nitrate between the sampling periods. Am I correct on that? So it's
Yes.
It's really would be at least what might be USGS's best estimation of the measured flow nitrate concentration and then nitrate loss. Am I correct on that? Okay.
Yep.
That's helpful. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think that we have, maybe we can put up where if anybody needs a CCA, CEU, and to eJukums by 5 o'clock today with your name. Oh, we're getting a couple. The name you entered to watch the webinar and your CCA number. And there was a question about the goals of the nutrient reduction strategy have stayed consistent with what's in the nutrient reduction strategy. So this modeling work and comparing that is not this is outside of that nutrient reduction strategy initial release. This is really trying to look at the estimates of load or predicting that load with the model that we have. So all right, so get your CCA to information to Liz by 5 today, and then the next slide we can get it to Mike. Mike Bursell will talk about an overview of carbon sequestration in ecosystems from the Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering at NC State University. So with that, I really want to thank folks for participating today. Thanks, Kay, for the presentation. And I was remiss. you get the last word. So any last comments that you want to share with folks?
So thank you for tuning in today. If you're interested in potentially using this R code, I've actually already gotten one email about it. Send me an email. I'd be happy to discuss further, and it is something we're looking to share in the future.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Everybody have a great day.